Washington Journal continues.
In this segment, we'll discuss the conflict in Syria. Here to discuss a new report on foreign fighters there is Richard Barrett. He's a senior vice president at the CSPAN group. Thanks for joining us this morning.
It's a pleasure.
Richard Barrett, you're out with a new report, and in it, it says that in just 3 years, 12,000 foreign fighters have traveled to Syria to fight. What does that number tell us?
Well, it's at least 12,000 from all countries. There's about 81 countries from which people who are living there or nationals of that country have gone to Syria, and that's a huge number. I think in the whole period of the Afghan war, from the start of the Soviet invasion in 1979 to the fall of the Taliban in 2001, maybe about 10,000 foreigners went to help out. So we're already in excess of that, and we're only 3 years in, and of course the Syrian war could last a great deal longer.
That seems to be a really large number. To you, what accounts to the rise or why there are so many here as opposed to the numbers you just cited in Afghanistan?
Well, of course, Syria is much more accessible. That's one thing. It's quite easy to get to Turkey, obviously, and then pretty easy to cross the border. Or if you're coming from the other direction, maybe from Jordan or from Iraq. But I think some of the other things that account for it is the sort of wide publicity that this has got, particularly in sort of extremist circles, particularly among people who are sort of interested in these issues of inter-Muslim conflict, of the oppression of Muslim communities and so on like that. And I think there's a younger group of people who've been attracted to this war than perhaps were attracted to Afghanistan.
What do you think accounts for the age difference? I know in your report you mentioned social media. Are there other mitigating factors?
Yeah, I think social media is a big thing, but I think that also just the interconnectivity of people generally, and people now in this sort of 15 to 25 age group, which is a very young age group to be going off to war, I think they see themselves as now participants, as people who can make an impact on society, perhaps more than people did in the late 70s and early 80s. And that may be a general social phenomenon, but it certainly seems true in Syria, that people are prepared to take control of their own lives at a much younger age and go off and do something fairly dramatic.
Our guest is Richard Barrett. He is a senior vice president at the CSPAN group, out with a new report that looks at foreign fighters and the conflict in Syria. For Republicans, the number is 202-585-3881. For Democrats, 202-585-3880. And for Independents, 202-585-3882. Richard Barrett, talk to us a little bit about where these fighters that are going into Syria are coming from, and what do they want?
Well, of course, the great majority are coming from the Arab world, from the Middle East and North Africa. That's the great spot. I mean, already from Saudi Arabia, I reckon there's well over 2,000, probably closer to 3,000 people who have gone to fight. And Tunisia, too, has extraordinarily high numbers. But then, in amongst them, there's about 3,000 or so who've come from Western countries, and that's predominantly Western Europe, but also Canada, United States, of course, Australia, New Zealand. What do they want? Well, I think what they want is a sense of purpose, a sense of fulfillment, a sense of engagement, a sense of belonging, perhaps more than anything else, that many of these people seem rather confused about what's going on in their own countries, perhaps where they fit in. For Saudi Arabia, for example, on the one hand, they're taught to believe in the importance of Wahhabism, Sunni-type Islam, and yet the government is quite strict in the limits to which they can practice that. So maybe they're thinking, well, maybe there are other places we can go to really fulfill sort of what we see as our religious obligation. They may be putting it strongly, but it's an attractive fight for, I think, many people who take their religion seriously and get misled into thinking that by fighting in Syria, they're doing something useful for their religion. Of course, it's not a religious fight. And then for the Europeans, I think that's even more so, that they feel that they need some sort of sense of belonging which they don't get in their country. Perhaps they're second or third generation immigrants, perhaps they're converts to Islam, already perhaps looking for meaning in their life greater than they've had already. So I think every individual is different, but these sort of themes seem to be fairly common among them.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the number of foreign fighters that are coming from Western nations, including here in the United States. I'm wondering if you can talk specifically about those that are coming from the United States. How many are there? What does that tell us? Is this government doing anything about that?
Well, there are about, well, certainly more than 70 and perhaps around 100 from the United States have gone there. And a typical example might be Mona Mohammed Abu Saleh, who blew himself up about 10 days ago in Syria, an attack on a regime post. Now, he's a 22-year-old from Florida, pretty normal. Yeah, took religion quite seriously, but I mean, very much in the mainstream, apparently. Keen on sports, had lots of friends, wasn't socially a social misfit in any sort of a way. And yet he was subject to this sort of way of thinking that somehow by killing yourself and killing other people with you, you would achieve something noble and special. So you have people from that end, and then people, of course, from maybe the Somali community too. Even there's a report now just out that someone from the Somali community in Minnesota may have gone to Syria. So no obvious connections with Syria, no family connections, no historic connections or cultural connections, but just feeling that this is part of a community, this is part of their Muslim community, and they should be doing something about it. But I would stress at this point that so many of those people, perhaps almost all of those people going, are not going as terrorists. They're going to help out. They think they're doing a good thing. And I think the danger is that when they're there, they get further radicalized and they get persuaded that actually they could do more and be more effective by coming back to the United States or some other country and attacking there. But it is quite a jump, of course, from one to the other.
One of the things that really fascinated me about this report is that it has to be really challenging to be able to quantify and to count how many foreign fighters there are. How did you go about doing that?
Well, it is difficult to make an accurate count, and certainly we were in touch with a lot of government officials, particularly in the security services, to ask them what their best ideas were of the numbers. And of course, for them it's really hard because so many of these people have gone, they have had no previous criminal record even, let alone a record of involvement with extremist groups. So really they're guessing as well, but to a certain extent by monitoring social media, by tracking investigations, by looking at death notices, unfortunately, and things like that, they can get a fairly accurate idea, I think, of the sort of quantities of people who are going. And then there are many, many countries, of course, who don't have any idea at all and just sort of have a rough guess that they've got some nationals there who may come back and be a problem. Quantifying overall, well, I think that when we added up all the figures that officials had, we came to a figure of about 11,000 or so. So it was fair to assume that the other 56, 60 countries would probably have another 1,000 between them.
Let's go to our first call for this segment in Germantown, Maryland. Mike is on the line for Independence.
Hey, thank you for taking my call. Listen, I missed the first few minutes of your guest here, but if you go to Infowars.com, and this is West War Crimes in Syria Exposed, this war in Syria, it's not about rebels versus Assad. This is all about the CIA, MI6, and the Israeli Mossad training and hiring mercenaries to attack Assad so they can get him under control of the European Union and the central bankers. This is all the phony war. This is all about overthrowing, just like we backed the fascists in the Ukraine and had staged a coup there. We're trying to take over Syria to use it as a staging ground to possibly attack Iran. All those so-called rebels, they're all hired mercenaries trained by the CIA. The true axis of evil is Washington, D.C., Tel Aviv, and the City of London.
Richard Barrett, your thoughts?
Well, I'd comment on that. I mean, the vast, vast majority of people fighting in Syria are Syrians. You know, huge, huge numbers of Syrians. And this civil war began in March 2011, really with protests which were perfectly peaceful. They were just protests very much in the tradition of the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening, which had been happening in many of the other countries of the area. And it was really only by the summer of that year that the extraordinarily harsh response of the Syrian government had made people realize that there was no way that peaceful protest was going to change the regime in Syria, and that they had to defend themselves on the one hand and attack on the other hand in order to achieve some sort of change. Now, 3 years on from there, we are facing a situation where there's probably about 150,000 Syrians under arms fighting the Assad regime. Certainly among that, we now know there are small groups of people who've been trained by outside forces and even armed by outside forces and financed by outside forces, not necessarily Western ones, but other countries that are interested in this fight. But without that vast amount of Syrians, ordinary Syrians who've taken up arms, who want to get rid of their president, there wouldn't be a civil war. It wouldn't be just a small group of people being able to cause this amount of damage and havoc. So I think we've got to put it in context. Certainly the policies of the Western countries, and many other countries as well, in the Middle East and so on, are to see the back of President Assad. But that cannot be done really by outside forces. This war will end by the people inside Syria, Syrians themselves, agreeing to some sort of way forward. Now that seems a long way off at the moment, and certainly the engagement of Russia on the one hand, the United States, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and all these other countries does have an effect. But essentially no settlement will really be enforceable and sustainable without the support of the Syrian people.
Next caller is in Cleveland, Ohio. Jeremiah is on our line for Independence.
Hi, good morning. How are you all?
Morning.
I just wanted to double down on one of the other callers' comments because we rarely on C-SPAN, I seem to see lately, have real informed callers calling and giving concrete data points. Syria definitely is a proxy war. The ambassador in Benghazi, Libya, was actually, it was a hit that went terribly wrong, and they were funneling the weapons that they're now arming Al-Qaeda on record in Syria, and all of the other foreign people that are there that are not a real civil war, like Libya was having with Muammar Gaddafi. But the cabal of the globalist thought process, which was a main discussion in this past 2014 Bilderberg group in Copenhagen, Denmark, that we're aware of. I just want to double down for the listeners because C-SPAN gave no coverage of Bilderberg, and C-SPAN has not given a lot of coverage concerning the actual armament of Al-Qaeda on record through Libya. That's why the ambassador was killed in Libya, because it was a hit.
Richard Barrett, your take.
Well, the peculiar thing about Al-Qaeda is that there's no country in the world that supports Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a menace. Al-Qaeda is a very negative force in both international affairs, globally, but also in regional affairs locally. And Al-Qaeda's exploitation of people's vulnerabilities, people's susceptibilities to persuasion that their own personal misfortunes are somehow tied up in a global sort of campaign to attack them as a community. They've been very, very successful in that, and as a result, of course, a great deal of damage since before 2001, of course, we had the East Africa bombings in, you remember, in Dar es Salaam and in Nairobi in Kenya in 1998. And even after that, the USS Cole attack and all these other attacks have shown that Al-Qaeda is really very determined to take this battle, which many groups had fought against local regimes, into a wider sphere to fight what they call the far enemy, which is the United States and other Western countries. And there is no country, even those countries who are most opposed to the United States, that would support Al-Qaeda and support this way of fighting a campaign, you know, terrorist attacks all over the place. I mean, if you take Russia, for example, they have huge problems in the Caucasus from people who are very closely allied to Al-Qaeda. Even in China, you have the Uyghurs there who have come to quite a lot of prominence recently in their attacks on railway stations and in markets and so on. And there, too, are very much closely allied with Al-Qaeda. So there's no country that wants to support them. And every country, including as expressed by the United Nations, wants to find some way to defeat them. Now, there are other terrorist groups around the place who may be supported by foreign countries. I mean, that's hard to say, though, in all cases. But I don't think that you're right to think that somehow Al-Qaeda is an expression of some sort of global conspiracy. This is a popular thought, particularly in some areas of the Middle East and South Asia. But any close examination of the facts, I think, shows that not to be true.
Richard Barrett, earlier you talked about combing through death notices, and I was paging through your report and noticed this one that you include. You say it's a picture of a Dutch fighter that was widely circulated by fellow fighters after his death. And the question it raises for me is this the kind of thing that can be used to encourage more people to join up, to join these foreign conflicts, to get involved, or what kind of role do these play? It looks like something that I haven't seen anywhere else.
Yeah, well, it is odd, and I think that one of the interesting features of the people who go to fight in Syria, particularly from Western countries, is they sort of exist in their own information bubble. They don't really pay very much attention to the sort of mainstream media, even within YouTube, Facebook, and stuff like that. They're really just interested in people who are reporting from Syria and talking about Syria from that perspective of these groups that are fighting President Assad. So you get somebody like that picture, which was of a guy from the Netherlands who got killed. And he'd been very active, that man. He'd started up a magazine particularly for people interested in the extremist views about the Syrian war. He'd be giving interviews to newspapers and so on in the Netherlands about what it was like to be there. And so encouraging people to think, you know, this is real, this is important, and this is something that you as an individual can contribute to. And this sort of iconic hero status, it's maybe putting it strongly, but that sort of publicity is available and accessible to anyone, even somebody who's had no involvement with anything at all can see that the trajectory of that man being a trajectory they could easily follow.
All right, let's take another call now from Hannah. She is in Athens, Ohio, on the line for Democrats.
Yeah, actually, I'm calling from Dayton, Ohio, but you mentioned the Leverett, Flint and Hillary Mann Leverett. They were both in the Bush administration. Flint stood against the invasion of Iraq. I believe he actually quit the Bush administration just before the invasion. But he was a former CIA Middle East analyst. And Hillary Mann Leverett, again, their website, Going to Tehran, they have stated several years ago that 50% of the Syrian people support Assad, that Assad was willing to do a deal where there were shared powers. And then they also talk about, they and former, Professor Juan Cole at Informed Comment, talk about part of what we're fueling is this destabilization of the Middle East for U.S. and Israeli interests. And that by supporting forces that we don't know who they are through military intelligence and weapons via different pathways, that we don't really know who we're supporting in Syria there. And so if you could talk about the Leveretts, Assad saying he would share powers, 50% of the Syrian people support Assad. And then I have one more thing about, you mentioned Al-Qaeda. Ron Suskind wrote a book years ago called The Price of Loyalty, where he talked about former Secretary of the Treasury Paul O'Neill under the Bush administration starting to investigate Saudi Arabian connections with financial support of Al-Qaeda. So if you could talk about that as well.
Right, okay, well, first of all, the offer by Assad to share power. I mean, the United Nations has had several rounds of talks of trying to engage the Syrian government alongside the rebels to talk about power-sharing agreements. And the Friends of Syria, which is a group of many states around the world, including the United States, including Russia and so on, sorted out a sort of way forward, that there would be a transitional government, a transitional process that would lead to a sharing of power, essentially, between all sections of Syrian society. But it would require for Assad to leave. And President Assad refused to accept that. He said, no, I'm going to stay, whatever happens. You know, and if these guys want to give up, then that's fine. We can sort something out. But essentially, I'm going to stay. Well, the problem with that was that the whole raison d'etre of the civil war was to get rid of Assad, to get rid of his clique, which has ruled Syria so fiercely over the years. So that wasn't really going to be a runner, but there have been tremendous efforts to try to negotiate some sort of settlement. It's in no one's interest to to keep that war going. It's incredibly destructive, not just to Syria and to the cohesion of Syria, but also, of course, to the regional stability generally. And that brings me to your second question about the issue of Middle East stability. An unstable Middle East is in absolutely nobody's interest as well. There's this sort of proxy war going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between sort of, if you like, very loosely, a Sunni way of seeing things and a Shiite way of seeing things. And that is quite destructive too. But I think you'd find that both Saudi Arabia and Iran realize their limits, that they're diminishing returns if instability increases too far. Lebanon, if you look at Lebanon, it's a fundamentally unstable society because of all the different interests there. And very important, I would have said, for Israel to keep some sort of level of stability in Lebanon. Turkey, too, now being affected to a certain extent. Jordan, another country with very deep social divides, which would not be in anybody's interest to see fall apart. And we can already see what's going on in Iraq, which is extremely destructive, not just to Iraq, but to world peace and regional security. So that was your second question. And the third question about we don't know who we're supporting, we don't know quite what we're getting into, I think is a very valid one. And I think that really showed itself in many conflicts around the world. But in Iraq, what happened, I think, that knocked al-Qaeda back originally, although they've come back with a vengeance since then, was that the Iraqi people themselves said, look, we've had enough of this, and if you help us to defeat these people, then we will do our best to do so. And so that was a sensible backing of a group that really had some impact and some ability to sort the situation out. But to your final point about the financing of al-Qaeda, unfortunately, there are several ways in which al-Qaeda manages to get money. Of course, there are criminal routes to getting money, but also there are donors still who believe that what al-Qaeda stands for is right and something they should support. And also, in a place like Iraq or Syria, there's control of territory, and control of territory gives you some ability to, well, I won't call them taxes, raising taxes, but to intimidate businesses and to extort money from businesses, to pump oil, to sell oil, stuff like that, you know, to govern the commercial interests of the people around you and the people who are subjugated to your rule. So there's lots of different ways now that they're getting finances, and almost you could say they're sort of self-financing, which is an extremely worrying development, really, because it removes from our hands one of the choke points that could have stifled them.
Let's go to the Republicans' line now, where John is on the line from Skokie, Illinois.
Good morning. My name is John. I was born and raised in Syria. You know, they talking about Bashar Assad. Bashar Assad has been great for Christian people in the whole, you know, Syria. We are Assyrian. They burn Muslim, they burn our village, they burn our church, they killed our bishop. You know, and here we try to help al-Qaeda killing Christian in Syria and Assyrian people in Syria. You know, you know, Bashar Assad, he take care of all Christians. He was the great president in the whole Middle East for Christian people. Now we try to condemn him because he don't want to help Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. You know, we spend our money and arms to send to those mujahideen, killing Christian people, burning the village of Christian people. Nobody know about Assyrian people. Our people, they suffer. Bashar Assad, he was good for Christian people, for Assyrian people. Now we don't have no place to go. My people, they don't have no place to go. You know, go Turkey, they cannot keep them there for long, okay? What are we going to do? We're going to help al-Qaeda to kill the Christian people and Assyrian people?
John, do you still have family in Syria?
That's where my cousins still live in Syria. They cannot go out during the night. They cannot go to work because mujahideen, they want to take their house, they want to kill them, they want to take their woman, you know, and, you know, do whatever they want to do, okay? I feel sorry for the Assyrian people and Christian people in Syria. Same thing, you know, around Damascus. They kill all the Christian and bishop, okay, and burn the church. We try to defend Mujahideen and Islamic Brotherhood. They want to control Iraq and Syria. Bashar Assad is great for Christian people and for Syrian people. We've been living there for 50 years. I served the army under his father. He was a great president for Christian people and for all people, not only for Christian, for Kurdish, for Durzi, for all the people. He was great for, all the Syrian citizens. Now we try to send Saudi and terrorists to Syria. Same thing, Qatar, all around, Islamic Brotherhood, they want to go to Syria fight Bashar Assad. Bashar Assad is a great president for Christian people and for Muslims.
All right, Richard Barrett, your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the great tragedies of Syria is that really it has been a wonderfully inclusive society, that people haven't minded whether you're Christian, whether you're Shiite, whether you're Alawite, whether you're Sunni or whatever. It hasn't really mattered. You're Syrian. And indeed, it hasn't really mattered whether you're Kurdish or Arab and so on, but, or Syrian or whatever. But unfortunately, the repressive nature of Assad and Bashar Assad, I think, became insupportable for people. And although he may have been fine in looking after those minorities, I don't think the majority of Syrians really believed that he was something that they wanted in charge of their country, that sort of government was not something they wanted. And I know Christians in Syria who are deeply opposed to the way Bashar al-Assad has been ruling and how his father ruled before him, because they're liberal people and they want a more liberal society, they want to be able to express themselves better, and they want equal opportunity for everyone. Of course, they don't want a whole load of people coming in and burning their churches and destroying their houses. Nobody would want that. And I think one of the huge challenges that Syria will face in the future is to remove the sort of growing sectarianism, the way that people identify themselves as a Christian or an Alawite or a Sunni or whatever, rather than as a Syrian, or rather than a member of this society, regardless of their faith, regardless of their ethnic origin, and so on. That will be very hard to put back together again. And you can see how difficult it's been in Lebanon, and it will be equally difficult, I think, in Syria. It's like, you smash an egg. Well, there's not much point in sticking all the pieces back together again. You still have a broken egg. So you need a new country that emerges from that, which is somehow, again, inclusive of all minorities.
I'm going to talk now about an article that was published by CNN yesterday about the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and their efforts to use Twitter to recruit foreign fighters. Now, in this article, CNN cites Western officials that say they are deeply concerned at not only the growing numbers of Western passport holders who have traveled to Syria to fight, but also the potential for more and more of these radicals to return to the West and continue that jihad through acts of domestic terrorism. And Richard Barrett, I'm curious if you know of any efforts by Western nations, the U.S. included, to act on those concerns that CNN cites.
Well, let's look at them separately. On the Twitter thing, this getting into the extremist narrative and being able to counter the extremist narrative and point out how false it is and that, in fact, it doesn't offer anything but misery to everybody, ultimately. That is really very, very difficult. People like to listen to people like themselves who have similar views, and those similar views sort of reinforce their own views, and so there's sort of a ratcheting up of extremism, radicalization within these groupings. And the Twitter has been amazingly popular, particularly in some areas of the Middle East. Facebook's popular in other areas of the Middle East, perhaps. But these sort of social media platforms have been tremendously effective for fighters in Syria to get the message across and to get a picture of fighting across, which suggests that, it's not that bad. You can survive, and they're tough people, there's camaraderie, there's good morale, and so on. We're doing fine, and all that sort of thing, which makes it less of a leap for an individual to go over there. And that comes to the second point about the fear of people coming back. It's fine. You're motivated to go to Syria because you think you're doing something good. You're encouraged by these Twitter feeds or Facebook posts and so on that make it look as though it's all a noble cause. That's fine. That's not a problem. You go over there with your foreign passport, and there's lots of clips of people on YouTube and so on burning their passport, saying, look, this is where I intend to be, and I'm not coming back. And it's not important that I'm an American or whatever. I'm now going to be part of this community fighting the regime. But of course, many people do come back, and many more people will come back. They may come back because they're disillusioned. They may come back because they're even disgusted by what they see there going on around them. They may come back just because they're tired and they want to go home, or they may come back because they think, well, you know, I made my contribution and now it's time to get on with the rest of my life. But also, they may come back severely radicalized, even traumatized by their experiences, and so slightly unpredictable in what they might do in the future. And they'll also come back with these very strong links to other people who are fighting with them. And so if terrorist groups are within those networks and are able to exploit them, then you have a problem on your hand in worrying even a returnee who looks perfectly normal, whether in the future he might not present some sort of problem.
In Ava, New York, Marianne is on the line for Republicans.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. Sir, I'm directing my conversation with you. From what I have seen and read, the United Nations have really never been effective in Africa and South America. The CIA has been involved in a lot of this, even in the Contras. It has been a proven fact that the CIA was involved in the drug collecting, making money down there. Even so, as far as I'm concerned, the truth about Obama sending guns, ammunition over there to Syria is the fact, and they're trying to squelch the Christian societies all over the world for the one world order, and this is what Obama was hired for. And he was trained well by a communist and also a satanic before he ever became a senator. So that's my point.
Your thoughts?
Well, the problems of dealing with Syria are enormous, and the problems, as you mentioned, in Africa and many other parts of the world are absolutely enormous. They almost defy solution. In Syria, I think that it's clear that the administration here and in many other countries would like to see the back of Bashar al-Assad, but what do you do to promote that? What do you do on the ground to promote that? And many of the rebel groups are saying, you have to give us surface-to-air missiles, because it's really the helicopters and aircraft which are beating us up the most, and we have no defense against them at all. And the United States and other countries said, no, we can't do that, because the risk of those weapons falling into the wrong hands, if you like, is just too great. And there may be attacks on civil aviation, or they may get into the hands of extremists and so on, and that would be disaster. It would be such a terrible own goal to have done that. But nonetheless, yes, there is a supply of weapons to the rebel forces, and let's hope that that is a sensible route to take, because I think many, many people in Syria, many other people around the world are saying, well, the West has made all this tremendous sort of hoo-ha about, yes, they'd like to see the back of Assad, but actually are doing nothing about it whatsoever. And the reason they're doing nothing about it, of course, is because it's so difficult to know what to do something that doesn't turn out to have been a mistake later down the road. And you mentioned some of the other policies and practices that many governments have followed, of course, by arming rebels or whatever, which have turned out to have been a mistake and to have turned into arming drug cartels or whatever. But in Syria, I think there's a much more cautious approach, a much more sensible approach, and a much more measured approach. And really, what President Obama is doing, like many other world leaders, is trying to see what can be done at the international level to sort this out, or to at least to lower the temperature so that people realize we've got to be finding a solution. The humanitarian consequences of the Syrian war, which have now displaced around 10 million people, are just extraordinary. That's in a country of about 23 million. So almost half the country have been displaced from their homes. And that is not something that the world can stand by and watch. Just indeed, as you mentioned, some of the conflicts in Africa as well.
Earlier this year, James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, spoke about the threat that Syrian foreign fighters have placed the U.S. homeland. Let's hear what he had to say.
What we spoke about before in Syria, what's going on there, is in maybe some respects a new Fatah force. and what's going on there and the attraction of these foreign fighters is very, very worrisome. Aspirationally, al-Nusra Front, to name one, does have aspirations for attacks on the homeland.
Richard Barrett, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's absolutely right. It is extremely worrying because the longer the war goes on, the more these groups are able to establish safe havens, like they did in Fatah, which is the area in Pakistan which is closest to the Afghan border. And in that area, of course, it's extremely difficult to go and root them out, even with drones. Now, they're not deploying drones in Syria, and I don't see any deployment of drones anytime soon in Syria, but the problem of getting rid of these people once they've set roots down is extremely hard, and then there's no predicting what they're going to do in the future. And as James Clapper said, Jabhat al-Nusra is a recognized branch of al-Qaeda, and therefore, although it's only focused on Syria at the moment, there's no reason to think in the future it may not switch its focus more broadly. The Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, the even more extremist group than al-Nusra, is also originally part of al-Qaeda. It claims not to be now, but that group, the ISIS, we call it ISIS, is not restricting its activity just to Syria and Iraq. It says, no, this is a global thing, and this is certainly a regional thing, because we're going to change our name and call ourselves the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, which means the whole of Levant. So it includes Lebanon, where ISIS has set up a branch, and will include Jordan, and indeed, in due course, I guess, include Israel. So that there's this sort of aspiration, as James Clapper says, to do much more than to fight locally against the Syrian regime.
Richard Barrett, I want to get your thoughts on comments made by Rob Ford, the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, talking about al-Qaeda. He says, from the beginning of the armed opposition, they sought help from outside countries, and they were very quickly competing for recruits, competing with al-Qaeda groups who had better funding and they could get ammunition in. So now we have a pretty serious al-Qaeda problem in Syria, and we were very slow to react to that. I'd be interested in your take.
Well, I think that's a fair comment, but it was very difficult to react to that because it was so hard to know what to do, as I said earlier. And now you have something called the Islamic Front, which is a group of other fighters, other rebels, who really are not so far different in their view from al-Qaeda, except that they don't see any reason to be attacking outside Syria. This is about Syria. Now, the Islamic Front has taken up arms against the al-Qaeda groups, or particularly against ISIS, and try and beat that back, because it realizes two things. First of all, that ISIS is bad for Syria, but second, that the fact that ISIS is so deeply engaged in the civil war means that Western countries in particular, but all other countries too, are very, very reluctant to provide help to any rebel group. So the Islamic Front think that if they can beat ISIS, or even if they can show they're fighting them very hard, then they'll be more attractive to donors, both in terms of funds and material. So we'll see how that plays out. But even those guys, sure, you know, they are not as bad as ISIS. They're not as bad as Jabhat al-Nusra, though they're quite close to Jabhat al-Nusra. But nonetheless, there are elements within them that are quite extreme. And so if they did take over in Syria, for example, we would, I think, have a problem of having a particularly extremist state in a very sensitive area of the world.
Palm Coast, Florida. Sarah's on the line for Independence.
Yeah, yes, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, excuse me. I got a frog in my throat, you might know. I go, good morning, Mr. I'm 80 years old, so give me a break. But I wanted to call last time about the media not understanding why the president did what he did with the young man from Afghanistan and let those five. Before he even got elected, he was talking about closing the Cuban Guantanamo. Okay, before he even got elected. And then it kind of got dropped because he got onto Obamacare and a bunch of other stuff. So we didn't hear much about that. But he's bad. The reason he did this is because of, and none of the media is even mentioned. And I watch Joe Scarborough every morning.
Sarah, we've moved on to a conversation about foreign fighters in Syria. I wanted to make sure I got your points.
Make one comment. The reason he did this is because he wanted to get our minds off of the VA scandal.
Okay. Did you have a comment on Syria or this discussion?
I said it was about, the reason he did this was to get our minds off of the VA scandal.
All right, our topic for this conversation is on foreign fighters in Syria. Let's move on to Lucy in New York on the line for Democrats.
Yes, hello. It's a fascinating interview. I just wanted to ask a simple question which might have a complicated answer. Are we giving terrorists too much attention?
Your thoughts?
Well, I think that's a very good question, a very interesting question, because, of course, terrorists do seek attention. That's the whole point, that they have a small group of people making a very large impact so that they get a lot of attention from the press, from the public, from government, from policymakers, and so on. And by creating fear, of course, they create a reaction. And they're not out to kill us all, they're just out to make us afraid that they might, so that we put pressure on governments to change policies. And in a way, if we could starve them of that sort of exposure, then they would see little point in perhaps being terrorists. I think the problem, though, with modern terrorism is that there's such an ideological conviction behind much of it. Well, perhaps conviction is too strong, but an ideological justification, which makes terrorism a little bit different from how it was in the past, when it was maybe anarchist terrorism, or when it was terrorism very much tied up with a particular cause, for example, between the groups in Northern Ireland. So now we have a situation where a terrorist can be performing an act of terror with in mind not just a simple policy change, let Ireland be free from British rule, but something much more complicated, much more out of the scope of policymakers to be able to deal with. And so it makes it much harder for everyone to address this problem. The media is bound to cover terrorist attacks. You saw the Boston attack, a dreadful attack, had 3 people killed and so on. And it was absolute wall-to-wall coverage for days. And that is understandable. It's going to happen again. So what do we do when 2 people attack a marathon in Boston without any real sort of reason, without any sort of policy platform they're trying to promote? It makes it much, much harder to deal with. And I think that we have to give terrorists attention because of the disruption they can cause. But I think fundamentally your question is a very good one.
All right, that's unfortunately all the time we have for this segment. Our guest has been Richard Barrett. He is a senior vice president at the CSPAN Group and the author of a new report on foreign fighters at the conflict in Syria. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. All right. Next up, recent news reports have highlighted the increasing number of immigrant children who are crossing the United States border alone. Coming up next, we'll be joined by USA Today reporter Alan Gomez. But first, let's go to C-SPAN Radio for a news update.
Well, jobless numbers in this hour show slightly more Americans sought unemployment benefits last week, but claims for the benefits continue to hover near 7-year lows. The Labor Department says weekly applications rose 8,000 to a seasonally adjusted 312,000. Applications are a proxy for layoffs, so the running average suggests employers are letting go of fewer workers and may also step up hiring. Well, President Obama and the other leaders of the G7 industrial nations have met in Brussels, and reports say they're prepared to impose further sanctions on Russia over its actions in Ukraine. The group released a joint statement condemning Moscow for what they call its continuing violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. The summit is the first since Russia was expelled from that group following its annexation of Crimea in March. And President Obama plans to meet with British Prime Minister David Cameron in Brussels after the G7 meeting. And after that meeting, the 2 leaders will hold a joint news conference. You can hear the event live at 10 a.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN Radio, or watch the news conference live on C-SPAN. Those are some of the latest headlines on C-SPAN Radio.